My name is Felicia Sitole. I'll be chairing today's press conference. Just to reiterate what I said earlier regarding the embargo, the report in your possession, it is under embargo until 11:30 when we lift the embargo. Wire services will be excused at 20 past to take your questions at the end of the presentation. Mr. Michael Manamela, he is the Chief Director of Accounts. DDG Jody Beer will deliver the presentation for us. SG will just quickly do an introduction. SG, ready when you are.
So we don't do sanitizations anymore. Where is the team that deals with? No, Mike, we should have a team that must do. You will not sanitize correctly. My worry is that even yesterday I had to remind them. So. Yeah. Joe, when you come here, make sure you sanitize. I don't trust our team anymore. Yeah. Good morning, members of the media, and again, greetings, members of the public. We are gathering here again today to look at matters of the GDP and in relation to the rebasing of the GDP. Stats SA, as the custodian of official statistics, follows international best practice as much possible. And this includes the periodic revisions of the estimates of national accounts. And when we talk about this international best practice, we are talking about looking at the United Nations fundamental principles of official statistics at a global level. At a continental level, we are looking at the African Charter on Statistics. And at a national level, we are looking at our own Statistics Act, that is Act number 6 of 1999. And in this regard, let me mention that there are a lot of cohorts of practices that we follow to improve on our statistics based on the discussions that we hold at global, continental, as well as national level. Today, we release the results of a 3-year project that updates the estimates of our GDP to more accurately reflect on the dynamics of our economy. These projects that we've been doing in the last 3 years provides an opportunity that we include new data sources, and over time in these 3 years, that's what we've been looking at. We are updating our classifications and estimation methods, as well as making improvements, especially in cases where international best practice has moved over the last few years. So this today makes the final part in terms of inviting you, members of the media, to help us to reach to our users as well as to members of the public in terms of these improvements that we have made. Let me mention that the revisions to the GDP are quite comprehensive, and we have started this, the bulk of these have been done in 2010 onwards. But of course, as far back as 2005, we introduced new methods as well as the revisions. Let me further say that it's critical to understand that these revisions are not the same as well as corrections to errors. We have had the case one time in the front page of the media when we gave the error of estimation, and then the front page said stats SA admits to errors. These revisions are not a way of saying that we are correcting errors, but revisions are a well-established principle that estimates can be improved and restated once more detailed and accurate data sets become available. And let us understand that data sets can be very expensive, and they cannot be frequently updated and be looked at from time to time as we deal with quarterly estimates. We make these comprehensive estimates available today along with the detailed document that describes the data sources and methods that were used. I have the pleasure to invite the DDG responsible for economic statistics, Mr. Joe De Beer, to come and make the presentation. Let me mention that together with other DDGs at Stats SA, Joe has a solid background in having served Stats SA for more than a quarter of a century in economic statistics. And in this regard, he brings with him a lot more experiences over time. Together with him and is Mike Manamela, who equally has closer to the number of years. Mike, you came to Stats SA in 1998 or
2000, so 21 years.
Yeah, so he's following closely into making a quarter of a century very soon. And on the difficult questions, I'm going to leave to the two colleagues. On the simple questions, direct them to me. I thank you very much.
Thank you, SG. Good morning, everybody. It's been a while since I did this. Let me see if I need my glasses or not. So today I will take you through the slideshow that deals with the results and the rationales behind the benchmarking and the improvement of our national account statistics. I'm doing this on behalf of a very big team that's put in a lot of effort over the last 3.5 years to come to this point that we have today. So why do we have to overhaul our national accounts? There are primarily 3 reasons why we need to do this. The first one that we do is to periodically rebase our statistics. That means we change the year that we use as the basis for our price statistics. The second activity we do is benchmarking. That means that we use the opportunity to incorporate new data sources that have become available. You will be well aware that when we estimate quarterly GDP, we do not have the full set of data sets available for that quarter. But once in 5 years, we can take a step back and see what new periodic data sets have become available and try to introduce those into our estimates of national accounts. And thirdly, we also use the opportunity to make any methodological changes. There are always estimation methods that you can improve. As the world evolves, we need to sometimes think about measurements slightly differently, learn from other agencies that have tried different techniques that more accurately describes the economy and these activities. So we use this opportunity to make those methodological changes. We do this in order to ensure that we have better estimates of the GDP. Let's talk a bit about adopting standards. It is best practice for any reputable statistics agency to periodically revisit the way it measures the economy. And that means you must introduce new standards that have been developed over time. We need to make sure that we remain relevant. Our statistics are only relevant if it is still accurate in terms of describing what's happening in the economy. If we publish statistics that are far removed from the real life, it's no longer relevant. So we need to make sure we can paint an accurate picture of what's happening in the economy. The GDP also informs other indicators. Prime examples of those would be the public debt to GDP ratio or expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP. So we need to make sure that the GDP is as accurate as possible to make sure that all these ratios and calculations that are based on the GDP are as accurate as possible. the SG mentioned in his opening remarks that this is something we do periodically. So let's just take a quick look on what we've done in the past. Going back as far as 1999, we did a benchmarking exercise in which we changed the base year to 1995. And at the time, we implemented something called the 1993 System of National Accounts. Those were the new standards and methods that we had to do. We used the opportunity to include new economic sectors, such as the informal sector, which was the taxis at that time. Telecommunications was the cell phone explosion that we saw in the 90s. Fast forward 5 years, then in 2004, we published a set of data with the 2000 base year. There we made use of a new taxation-based business register, and we introduced the concept of supply news tables to estimate the annual numbers. I'll explain the supply news tables in a bit more detail later, but primarily think about what is supplied in the economy and what is it used for. And supply and demand must be the same. Then you have a fair amount of confidence in the accuracy of your numbers. 5 years later, in 2009, we introduced the concept of what's called the non-observed economy. In essence, that tells us we need to estimate for any economic activity that we cannot directly measure. Now, most of that would be the informal sector, but it also deals with illegal activities and the like, and we made our first estimates for that in 2009. We expanded the level of detail of the supply news tables at that time. The previous occasion of benchmarking, 2014, so this is now 7 years ago. Due to COVID, we slipped a year in this process. We switched to a more updated system of national accounts, a 2008 one. You'll remember I said previously we went to the 1993, now we went to 2008. A couple of notable improvements we did. We capitalized research and development, stock options as part of your salaries and wages, quite a few other items that we improved. A couple of new data sets, Census 2011 could be used, income and expenditure survey of households could be used, and a number of what we call large sample surveys could be made use of. What were the impact of those four benchmark exercises that I just described? We can see that it changed the level of GDP. Level of GDP meaning the size of the economy, the size of the GDP. And those increases started off at 13.5%, which was by far the biggest one out of the four, and then 3.8%, 1.8%, and 2.8%. Now let's focus a bit more on today's exercise. What were the improvements that we've made this time around? Again, rebasing, benchmarking, new methods, but also the fourth one was the removal of annualization in our quarterly estimates. Some of you that's been to these press conferences in the past can recall that we showed you the slides of annualized and non-annualized numbers, especially when COVID came to play, and we had those huge drops and huge increases in the quarterly growth rates, and we then decided to change tack and publish the seasonally adjusted growth rates, but that are not annualized. Rebasing, in this case, we moved the base year from 2010 to 2015. New data sources, there's a host of them listed on these slides, either internal in nature or external. Internally, we cover the entire spectrum of the releases that Stats SA publishes, or at least 90% of them, and they range from our structural industry statistics, agriculture statistics, many other formal business surveys, labor data, information from our household surveys, mining data, capital formation. Externally, we have good partnerships with other data providers, such as the Central Bank, South African Reserve Bank, Receiver of Revenue, National Treasury, and then various line ministries such as Mineral Resources and Energy, Agriculture, and a range of other administrative sources. New methods. The first one is maybe the one that caused the biggest change to the numbers, and that's where we refined the industry and product classifications. In the past, we used to classify a business based on what the primary economic activity was. As an example, if you were in a manufacturing industry, but you also did a little bit of sales, then we treated your entire economic activity as part of the manufacturing industry. And that still remains the case for our surveys. But in order to make the national accounts a bit more relevant to the economic performance of specific industries, the team put a lot of effort in to try to isolate those trading activities, as an example, from manufacturing, so that we could move it from manufacturing to the trade services where it belongs. A bigger difference came in, which we will see in subsequent slides, is where we intensified our research to better understand education and health in the economy. Previously, education and health was just viewed as part of general government because that is where it was supplied. But we managed to work through alternative data sets in order to isolate the exact economic activity of those two industries and move them to where they statistically belong in our classification system, and that is within the personal services. So we will see that there's been a shift from what we used to call general government to what we call personal services. In terms of methods, it was improved methods that we had to estimate the taxes that we levy on products and on production, the calculation of trade and transport margins. Basically, that just means the profit that we make when we buy or sell something or transport something. Measurement of the trade in services, which is sometimes very difficult to do. We revisited the entire supply and use table framework with different product classifications, different techniques to make sure the numbers talk to each other. And then the concept of calendarization. Whenever a business reports to us, they report for a specific financial year. Now that financial year might run from 1 January to 31 December, for which we would be thankful because their economic activity fits exactly into our reporting year for a calendar. But what if the financial year of that business runs from 1 July until 30 June, or from the end of March to April to March? Then we need to make an adjustment and say that we're going to use only a portion of the financial statements of that business for this calendar year and use a portion from a different set of financial statements in order to build our own calendar year to make sure that the GDP for that year actually reflects what happened in that calendar year. And then, as I spoke to a little bit earlier, we're removing the annualization from the headline rate. Now, what are the results of all of these techniques that I've spoken about? First and most important is that the size of the economy in our new base year of 2015 is viewed as 9.2% larger than what we've estimated it before. On the graph, we show the results for 10 years, and in that period we can see that the revisions range from 8.6% in 2014 up to 11% in 2020. But how does that compare to other regions in the world? The IMF did a study a number of years ago where they had a look at the size of revisions from these groups of countries in the most recent year that they did benchmarking. And we can see out of the 56 countries in the survey that they did, the revisions range from about a negative 30%, the light blue bar, up to close to 70%, the darker blue bar, with an average of around 17-18%. That differed based on those subsets of countries, whether you're looking at emerging and developing countries, Latin America and the Caribbean, or sub-Saharan African countries. The average of South Africa, the 9.2, 10, 11%, therefore is not out of the ordinary if we compare it to those groups of countries. What we might notice is that the OECD countries are not part of that report, and typically they would have smaller revisions because their statistical systems are much more advanced than any of the countries in this IMF report. Growth rates, when the level of the economy changes, invariably the growth rate will change. So in this chart we can see what the previous annual growth rates were in the darker color, and then the reddish color are the new revised growth rates, and typically it gives us the same trend of these numbers. Now, if you had to ask somebody what is most important, is it all about the level of GDP or is it about the growth rate in GDP? And that is a difficult question to answer because it will depend on your view of the economy and what you're trying to talk about. I can maybe explain it to say that it's important for us to know what the level of your salary is. Is your salary 5,000 Rand, then you went up by 10% to 5,500? That's of course important. But once you are used to your salary being 5,500, now we're more concerned about what's my annual salary increase. Is it 2%, 3%, minus 1%? So your focus shifts depending on your point of view that you have at the time of using the statistics. Let's unpack that previous graph a little bit more and look at the quarterly numbers. Again, the grey is the old and the reddish color is the new ones. We've taken the liberty to not show the 2 COVID quarters to its full extent because that just destroys the graph and you can't see anything on the y-axis. But typically, what one will look at is to see if there are different patterns in these quarterly growth numbers. And if you take a casual glance, you can see that in many quarters, the little bars stay positive or they stay negative. But there are 1 or 2 important ones that I wish to highlight in this case. In the previous set of national accounts, we typically had a situation where the first quarter was reported as being negative. But we have done a lot of work with our colleagues from our methodology branch, assisted by experts from the IMF, to review the seasonal adjustment techniques that we use in the organization. And we can now see on that chart, if you focus on the first part of each one of those years, that in many cases the negative first quarter number has now resulted in a positive first quarter number. The second one I want to draw our attention to is the first quarter of 2020, where the negative first quarter became a positive first quarter. But what makes it interesting is that previously you had 3 consecutive negative quarters. So that put us firmly into a recession for those 3 quarters. But now with the third quarter being a positive number, we are still in a recession, but it's not as deep as previously because you still have the 2 negative quarters. But let me hasten to add, the fourth quarter number there is so small negative that it doesn't really show on the chart. It is really a negative on the, I think, the 3rd decimal place. When the levels change, the next question to ask is, but what caused the change in the levels? Which industries are now bigger or smaller? This chart shows us what the previous number was, the blue dot, and what the new number is, the red dot. And it's also grouped based on what the new size ranking is. So we can see that in the past, finance, real estate and business services was by far the biggest. The blue dot was the most to the right, and that has now grown even bigger. It's even more to the right. It had a plus 191 billion rand of value added in the 2015 base year. Personal services used to be relatively small, sort of middle of the pack, the blue dot. That moved quite strongly to the right and is now the 2nd largest industry. We added 439 billion rands worth of value added to that industry. Trade and catering accommodation stayed basically the same. Manufacturing is up a little bit. Transport stayed the same. General government is a big drop, 283 billion, and is now only the 6th largest industry compared to previously the 2nd. Mining and quarrying is down a little bit, and then the rest stay basically the same: construction, the utilities, and agriculture. Now, what are the reasons for these huge changes? Let's talk about the finance, real estate, and business services one first. As we mentioned, it had an upward revision of 191 billion rand, and that came primarily from 3 big reasons. The first one was a huge improvement in our coverage of what we call other business services. Up to a number of years ago, we did not include this classification item in our annual financial survey. We started changing our samples so that we cover that. That unearthed a lot of extra business activity that we now can include into the national accounts. Similarly, our estimates and coverage of the computer and related services industry gave us an extra 40 billion. We also changed our estimates of owner-occupied housing for an extra 30 billion. For just as a reminder, the owner-occupied housing is the phenomenon where if you're a homeowner, even if you have a bond, we have to treat it as if you are renting from yourself. And then a couple of smaller ones added the last billion. So generally speaking, this industry group improved due to better coverage of the economic activity that we had. Personal services, this is the one that had the biggest shift. Starting with the move of education from government. We've isolated education from within government and improved the way that we estimate it, both on public and private aspects of education. That added 244 billion. Health, the same situation. We isolated the health expenditure within the different provincial government departments, national, and we were able to move that to personal services. That gave us an extra 128. And then generally just better estimates and new data sources covering recreation, sewage and water, and then the non-observed economy and a few smaller ones. All that contributed to an upward revision of 439 billion. So in this case, it was not so much only new data sources, but a change in the classification and the methodology on how we treat it. Government, it's in a way just a mirror of the previous slide, where we've now taken away the health and education from government, and that dropped it by 283. There were a couple of other smaller changes, but we didn't try to put everything on the same slide and to clutter it. This was now talking to the supply side of the economy, so we know what industries supply GDP, and if there are a higher supply of value added, there surely must be a higher demand, because supply and demand must be the same. So let us look what happened to the demand in the economy. Basically nothing changed apart from household final consumption expenditure. You can see that moved from the blue to the red with an extra 395 billion rand, where the others had changes but relatively small. Within the households, what were the drivers behind those changes? This is not listed in order of the highest value for the component, but rather it's listed according to the biggest percentage change. Now, I got that the other way around. So for the first one, recreation and culture, that added by 90 billion, so it had the biggest absolute value increase, which equates to 84%. Then restaurants and hotels, we added 79 billion, which was 125% higher. So it's a huge percentage increase on restaurants and hotels. And we can go through the list and see how we, for each one of these, made a bigger or smaller adjustment. Maybe we can point out in the middle of the graph the health expenditure. That also talks to our improved methods for estimating the production of health services. So we had to counter that with the demand for health services of 26 billion. Then at the bottom, there was a decrease of 99 billion for food and non-alcoholic beverages. Now, one must view that decrease in food and non-alcoholic beverages with the uptake we had for restaurants and hotels, because in a way it offsets the way you classify the expenditure on the food, whether it was consumed at home or was it expenditure within the food and hotel industry. So those two is in a way a bit, let me say, offsetting each other. The non-observed economy, in some of the previous slides we spoke about the introducing non-observed for the first time. So this time around we've estimated the non-observed as being 8% compared to the observed economy. And we can, non-observed is primarily the informal sector, not only the informal sector, but it's primarily the size of the informal sector. Now, because it's so interesting to talk about the informal sector, especially if you think about labor statistics where employment in the informal sector is always very topical, we need to understand where does the economic activity take place in the informal sector. So this graph breaks up the non-observed economy, and it shows that the biggest portion of the non-observed happened in the personal services. And the biggest one there again would be your domestic services that we have. And then added to that smaller ones such as sport activities, beauty, hairdressers, nails. There are many different ones that feed into those personal services. Not surprisingly, second, trade, catering, accommodation. Lots of traders, we see that economic activity happening everywhere. Then it gets generally smaller as we go down the groupings. What's the impact of this revised GDP? Many socioeconomic indicators rely on the GDP. I've spoken about some of these, and an improvement in GDP, although it changes this measure, purely makes the measure more accurate. So all the analysts and policymakers that rely on these indicators should welcome an improved estimate of GDP. An example of an indicator that goes up, GDP per capita, in current prices, 2015, previously 73,000 per person, that's revised to 79,000 per person. So sometimes the number will go up, but in other cases the number will go down. What is the percentage of investment in the country as a percentage of GDP? So that has dropped by roughly 2 percentage points. And this one might be quite concerning for economists and analysts, because the general health of an economy is often judged by the investment ratio that the economy has. And the general agreement in the country is that investment of 16-17% in the most recent years was too low, and now that has dropped even further. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the supply news tables. This is actually the more interesting part of it. The supply news table gives us for each commodity, Alicia, I can't see that far. Okay. So the embargo will be lifted at 11:30, right? Is it now? Okay. The embargo is then lifted. For the good part of the presentation, stay seated. It's coming. So the supply news table will estimate for us, for each of the different type of product, what was supplied and what it was used for. And it's only if you compare supply and demand that you can find a weakness in the data and fix it. So this picture says that anything that's supplied is either locally produced, or there's a margin on it, somebody's making a profit from it, or it's imported, or it is taxed. Anything that you buy has those four elements to it. Who uses it? Either we use it as households, industries use it as part of the manufacturing process, government uses it, it becomes capital formation, or we export it. That's the only thing that can happen to any product. Let's look at a few examples. Fish products. They are mostly locally produced, 95% of them are produced, very little trade and transport margins on fish, a little bit of tax, we hardly import fish, and it's mostly used by industries, 58%. Industry will buy the fish, will can it, we'll have pilchards, and for those of us on Twitter, we'll see some recipes that include pilchards if we follow some of our previous ministers. Another example, meat products, again locally produced, but we can see the margins moving up a bit, but this time it's mostly used by households and not so much used by industry. Tobacco is an interesting one. The biggest portion of supply comes from the taxes on tobacco. Local production 39, very little imported, and then the taxes. But it's mostly used by households, because why would an industry use tobacco? Footwear, in this case, the margins and the imports are basically the same, and it all goes to households. Crude petroleum is something that is mostly imported, crude petroleum and gas, and that flows nearly directly through to industry. And we can unpack the industry then a bit further. We say most of that in the industry goes to petroleum refineries, and then there's a few little other industries that can use portions of that. Jewelry products, local production 56%, some decent margins on that 28%, and we export most of those jewelry that we produce locally. This graph shows us then the top 5 products. So if we just go through some of them, in terms of local production, the product that is produced most locally is public administration. You don't need statistics to know that. Government services will be produced locally, as well as construction services. If we go to the next graph, taxes less subsidies, petroleum, that is the product that generated most of the taxes, 82 billion, followed by alcoholic beverages and the motor vehicles. Imported is the motor vehicle parts, crude petroleum. Then if we go to the use side, we can see that the 5 products that were consumed most by industries is the very descriptive other business services before we get to petroleum oils, different support services, and I'll unpack these ones a bit on the next slide. What do households typically spend on? Owner-occupied. That means housing is the biggest one of these products. Then expenditure on health, then transport, then insurance and parts, and then your motor vehicles. Exports, as we well know, is mostly basic metals and steel, our precious metals, and then the motor vehicle parts. And just to unpack those 5 consumed by industries, a bit more details, the other business services includes aspects such as management, architects, engineering, scientific advertising activities. Petroleum is the crude petroleum, the oils, support services, going down to rental and supporting transport. So far we've spoken about the production side of the economy, and we've spoken about the demand side. And you will know that we sometimes talk to that as GDP by the production approach or GDP by the expenditure approach. But we also have a third approach to GDP, and that's GDP by the income approach. Typically, you would calculate the GDP as the sum of all the profits that's made in an economy, which we then call the gross operating surplus. It's not as simple as that, but for this purposes, it's good enough. And the second component would be the compensation of employees, the salaries and wages that comes from a business. So it is sometimes insightful to compare these two components of value added to see how they differ between industries and how they differ over time. So in this case, we have said, let's express the compensation of employees as a ratio of the gross operating surplus in 2015 for the different industries. So this means, in the case of construction, for every R1 of gross operating surplus that the construction industry generated in the form of profits and the like, they spent R2.34 on compensation. And if we go down the list a bit, we can see in the case of agriculture as an example, for every R1 operating surplus generated by the farming community, they spend 65 cents on the compensation of employees. Now, this type of analysis becomes quite technical, and one should take a lot of care in understanding and analyzing the subsectors. But for illustrative purposes, we thought it will be useful to draw your attention to this. And then, of course, if you look at it over time, you can see if it's a once-off event or whether there's something systematic changing. Go to agriculture again. In 2013, that ratio was 0.66. In 2018, 0.63. So hardly any change in that ratio for agriculture. But if we go to construction, we can see a much bigger change. In 2013, their ratio was R2.02 of compensation for every R1 of operating surplus, and that has since expanded to R2.97 in 2018 for every R1 of operating surplus. All of this and how we managed to derive the estimates, which different surveys went into which variables, a lot of the techniques that we've done, we have a report, there's a copy there that I'll wave at you a bit later, that the team developed. This is also on our website now. It's 200 odd pages of interesting reading if you're a national accountant. If you're not, still give it a try. It might convince you to convert. And that's all we have for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, DDG. We'll now open the floor for questions.
On the GDP rate ahead of the upcoming Q2 release. You already mentioned last time you gave us roughly annualized and not annualized. So I just want to check, will it be the same in the upcoming release, even though the headline number will be the not annualized, or you just give us one headline number? If you can give us clarity on that.
Should I move the mics? Okay. Kenny, do you want to move the mics for me?
With regard to annualization, we've had a couple of engagements with users. And I think it's quite clear that in terms of the growth rates, we need to move away from annualization, which we all agree. But a lot of economic models and analysis, when it comes to the actual numbers, was based on the annualized numbers. So they've made the request that the actual numbers must still remain annualized. However, in terms of reporting for the growth rate, we'll only report one number, which will be the annualized growth rate. So to give an example, let's assume that in Q2, the value add was 2 billion. You annualize it, it will be 8 billion. But the growth rate that we're reporting will only be, say, if it's 2%, it will be 2%. We will not say 2% with the effect of 4. So we'll only report 2%. So those are the two distinctions.